Welcome to Conversations. My guest this afternoon is Mr. Dave Wilson. I'm thrilled to have Dave here. Dave, you're sort of the gay teacher. If I tell people that you're going to be on the show, they say, oh yeah, the gay teacher, I know him. And I sort of felt that way too, and then you and I had coffee last Saturday, and I had a chance to get to know you, and I was so impressed. Your intelligence, your dedication, all those things, and so I'm really thrilled that you came on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Let's do the gay teacher thing first. What you're most known about town for is having come out as a gay person, and what made you decide to do that? How did that fit into your life?
When we were talking, I think we discussed some that coincided with big changes in my life, which were transitioning from having been a married man for almost 2 decades into coming out, basically. And my philosophy as a teacher is that I wanted to try and represent as best I can what's happening, the integrity of my personal life in my teaching, and use it, you know. And so I think kids had more of an idea before I did, because I really do that. When I teach, I give pieces of myself all the time, almost not realizing sometimes what I am giving them. But it certainly got to a point where either I was going to hide things in terms of being a closeted, gay male in a Montana community, or actually just do what felt like had to be, which was be out. And so that was occurring. At the same time, I had 3 kids who were also coming out a little after I decided to, but it was all of those things at once. And then just that's a tremendous freedom that gave me to deal with that topic in the class and all the associated topics that are with it, you know.
It also meant that you were there for these kids who wanted to come out, and someone to talk to as well.
Yeah, it's been all positive in terms of experience with the high school, because as I was on the verge of coming out, there were several boys and some girls who were in the school who needed someone to talk to, like you're saying, and knew about me because I'd revealed, with some staff members, and then was doing the whole bit. And so we kind of did impromptu, gay-straight alliance sessions before it began.
Well, that's great. How far up the chain does this acceptance go? I mean, have you talked to the superintendent of schools locally, or just the principal, or?
I'd certainly say the superintendent of schools, Mary Wagner, is well aware of my position. She's aware of the Gay-Straight Alliance. Going back just a bit to my principal, who I really had no apprehension about telling him, but still, there's a catch inside of you from having lived here in Montana, in the atmosphere that we live in, where you have that constructed fear from the time you're tiny. I remember going in and telling him that I had something to say in terms of how my teaching was going to change, the topics that I'd be addressing somewhat, and just who I was in general and staff, and told him, and then he didn't say anything for a while. And then he looked up and said, well, do you have anything to tell me that's really, that would make a difference to me or is important in terms of, changing, him changing his opinion of me? And I said, thank you. That's great. And he said, yeah, that's wonderful, and that changes nothing with me to tell you that. So
it's fabulous. You teach Spanish?
Yeah. I taught speech for 7 years also.
Oh. And what level of kids are you dealing with?
I teach freshmen through seniors, and then I also teach at a private institute in town where I do literature, novels and short stories and whatnot, and grammar. And this year I did teach a grade school class. After I was out of my regular session at school, I taught that for 7 months, I believe.
We talked the other day, and I was talking about my past and what school was like for me, and also the fact that I taught for a year, so I have some insight of what goes on behind the scenes. Maybe we could compare some of what it's like now and what it was like then. When I was in high school, gays sort of didn't really exist. I mean, there were kind of things around the edges, but I really wasn't. In high school now, what kind of world are the young gay people dealing with?
No, I think that I remember, too, being in high school, and certainly, first of all, it wasn't anything anyone talked about, basically. And I grew up in Montana, Kalispell and Whitefish, and you didn't talk about it. nor did you hear that word very frequently, and it was always in a pejorative manner. Now that's not true. You know, we hear queer, gay, faggot, homosexual, et cetera, right, all the time. And so some of that's very positive now because it deals with tolerance issues, right? But I'd say that by and large, most of what we hear now is still or is negative, offensive, prejudiced. And so you know, that's the work in the high schools, is that there is a profile and a presence, but the work is now carving a place of tolerance and acceptance.
So then you would say that the kids coming out now, or it would seem to me, or in some ways have it harder, even though we live in a more tolerant society. It focuses on them. They have to make these decisions early and more publicly than you or I ever had to.
If the kids are going to come out at the high school level or middle school, which in some places they do, they're going to be under fire, you know. And so some of the kids thrive on that. I have some kids who are out for that very reason, that they feel their duty and obligation is to be under fire and talking, and perhaps more importantly, in proximity to lots of people, right, who have to deal with it then. And also they have to feel that this is a person and not just a title. And so that's part of what happens now. And some kids collapse under that, of course, as do, you know, all of us collapse in one way or another, I think, and then rebuild ourselves.
I notice I have some young friends, and at that age they seem to, they want to tell everybody they're out. They want to, and I usually recommend a little discretion. I see no reason why you have to tell grandmother right away, but they're far more active that way. Tell me about the Gay Straight Alliance. How does that work with the kids?
The Gay Straight Alliance at Big Sky really began because, not because we were sitting around brainstorming what could we do as a group of people who are bisexual, gay, transgender, et cetera, right, but more out of a need for protection, partly for 3 people who are coming out in the summer, 3 students in Big Sky High School. And their concern and my concern was that there be some kind of a safe haven or harbor, sponsored by a teacher, preferably, who had some personal experience, sympathy, or whatnot with Gay Straight Alliance. And so I seemed like a natural choice, I think, to them, and I was totally out in the high school by that point. And so simultaneously with their having an article published in Outspoken that very much outed each of those kids, and me again in Outspoken, because then they talked about having me as their advisor. That's the initial birth of the Gay Straight Alliance. And I think, to refer to your other question, at that point we have a site-based committee at my high school which teachers help direct what's happening in the high school or are part of the direction of high school. And so I was the chairman at that point, and had it was an interesting position for me because I was able to say, without having to go and submit some kind of application for protection, this is what I'd like to see, and do you support it? And the people were all people that I had on that committee were supportive from throughout the school. And then talked about the kids, talked about what they were going to be going through and my worries for protecting them, right? And then that's all in the time period of Matthew Shepard and several other things that were occurring in the U.S. that really threw tolerance into high profile. And so that was the birth of it.
Might have made it a little easier at that particular time.
It did, and I think that's sad a little bit, that we have to have some kind of martyrdom and continued high-profile violence to institute acceptance and tolerance, but it's a place to put your foot in also.
Well, better than ignoring his death, I think.
Yeah.
I was, Matthew Shepard for me was a real, watermark or something. I felt I couldn't go on doing things as lackadaisically as I had before, that lives really were at stake. And I think he galvanized the country and a lot of people in this country that way. Let's talk about the kids. How has it been for them? Do you have any clue how they're feeling and dealing with these issues?
I think that initially some of the kids thought it would be, I think that with some of them there's a confusion in their mind, that they're really interested in adventuring into queer life, right? At the same time, they also think that the tolerance and equity issues and whatnot are all very interesting. But then when it comes down to it, it's unrelenting pressure, prejudice, name-calling. It's not pleasant in many ways, with an occasional bright spot. And so some of them have had a lot of trouble with that pressure. Others have, like I said, thrived on that pressure and feel that it's even diminished in some cases because they're there and there's nothing outrageous about their behavior or et cetera that makes kids, change their viewpoint of them. And I'd say with myself also, kids were a little trepidatious. When I first came out, they were wondering what would happen next, because they all have a stereotype of what a queer or a gay or a faggot in their terms is, right? And so I'm still doing the same thing I'd done before, and there's no big change. And so many kids have settled down into, accepting me, not having a problem, and also remodifying or modifying better their language. So that's one big change that I see there is modification of language in our school to some extent.
If you had it to do again, would you do it?
Of course, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it's been great.
So it's been a positive experience for you.
It has, yeah. For me, it's been more than the kids.
Maybe you're not aware, but you have become kind of a hero here in town. People know about you without having met you or have a certain awe for what you've done, even when they're not quite sure what it was. And you really have been a role model for a lot of people in this community.
That's very nice. I have to say, though, that for the Gay Straight Alliance, the real impetus there were those kids coming out, right, in that kind of atmosphere, which is really sort of war zone-ish in a certain way, for them, is the most amazing thing. So that was quite impressive, I thought.
Do you think we could get one of them on the show, maybe?
I do.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I do. That's something that we'd have to pursue that for sure.
Let's talk about this issue of teachers and education and students and young and old. There is a perception that gay people might be a bad role model for kids, and I think you and I have settled all those issues for ourselves long ago, but for anyone out there, how would you address that?
I think that if I've had negative comments, which there have been some, they've revolved precisely around the fact that I'm not a proper moral model for kids. And so that's something I've talked to my kids about directly, and of course some of them kid me about that, but on the other hand, all those pieces that fall around what you're talking about have to do with the stereotype of gays, right? That they know are not true, right? Or we are people, right? And so for everybody, you just have to judge each person individually. And so I'm not a pedophile preying on children, right? Which is one of the main objections that parents have for a gay man teaching in a public setting, right? Nor do I talk about intimate sexual contact between men, of course, in detail, right? I don't at all hide the fact that who I love is a man, right, and who I live with my kids. So et cetera, I think all the things that parents are most afraid of, or administrators, is perhaps the folklore of how gay men are predators and things to do with that.
You talked about your wife. Was this coming out in school? How did that fit chronologically with the end of your marriage, if I may be so?
My wife and I have been separated since 1996, or maybe a little before that, actually. And my coming out in school was really, I was actively meeting other men and had some short relationships, probably in '97, from there on. And coming out was 3 years ago, basically, and then really in the last 2 years, for lack of a better expression, full-blown way, right? And she's totally in support of that. We have a daughter that goes back and forth between our two houses, which is a fabulous thing, I think, because she's in a household that's basically, if you could label households heterosexual, kind of, middle-aged American household, and then our household, which is gay, middle-aged American household, and so she does exposure of the two worlds, or exposure to those two worlds. So. But then there are no problems between us concerning that, her going back and forth.
Let's talk about this question of the role of the teacher in the school. My kids were always trying to do something to engage you, to tease you, pranks, whatever, but they also, in my case, I thought were, pretty loving. The teacher, his personality in relation to what he's teaching, would you care to address that issue?
Yeah, I think what we talked about, I think that's one of the most important things, that you represent your life with the kids, and perhaps sometimes your subject core area is not the most important thing. It is not the most important thing oftentimes, and rather, I am trying to model to a certain extent flexibility, variation, creativity, etc. through my own life. Our life is, it's horrendously cliche, but it is something that we paint, right? It's a piece of art. So mine tends to be varied, very varied, and I want kids to see that. I want them to know that they have the potential for anything, and over again, and backwards and forwards in whichever way, right? And I think they see that in my life, and they appreciate that. Although they do, that doesn't stop them from kidding me sometimes, etc. But I don't have kids that are vicious or poking or being mean, with their observations. Although I have, and that's part of what happens, then you have that confrontation that becomes a display for other kids to watch and see how you handle that. So it couldn't be any other way, I think. Also, I talked a little to you about when I went to Cuba with my partner Casey earlier this year. When we did a conference on education. It was people from all over the world, mostly the Caribbean and the U.S. And we were talking about technique in the classroom, and so I was doing a thing on basically playing yourself and a number of other roles, and kind of a Judith Butler idea of who are you in front of your kids. And there were several articles that I read that were talking about teachers who had lived, most of their teaching career closeted, and how that ate at them, chewed away at them. And that the kids knew anyway. For the entire time that they were closeted, the kids knew anyway. You weren't hiding anything, So why play the game?
Yeah.
Although, I'm the least, should not be saying why play the game, because I did that for so long. But
some people feel that necessity still.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk a little bit about Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
What was that experience like?
It's the second time I've gone to Cuba. It's the same conference. It's called Exchange between North American and Cuban Pedagogos in Spanish, but teaching teachers, and it deals mostly with people from university level who train teachers. And Cubans have a lot to offer in terms of teaching people from around the world in the U.S. About technique, flexibility. There's a real kind of reversal in Cuba in terms of we're not delivering to kids a lot of stuff to put on top of them and apply to them, but we're really trying to work with what's inside of them, draw it out, and compare what we have inside ourselves and draw that out, and then use that inside our subject areas, So that really talks to the kind of, with my Spanish teaching, I prefer to work with kids' experiences. What do they have, and then can they build a vocab around their own life and teach that kind of, that's the method for my teaching. But the conference has about 100 to 150 people who all do a shortened version of a 30-minute presentation about some sort of teaching style. And there tends to be some fairly radical groups from the U.S. and Cuba who deal with ethnic pride, gender issues, and gender pride, about where people are with their gender evolutionary process. Plus, you're in Cuba.
Oh. When I taught school, the whole system just really appalled me in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
I had a kid who was fabulous at fixing cars, and I could never convince him that to throw a ball was not a sentence. He shouldn't have been held back 3 years. He should have been out fixing cars, you know.
Mm-hmm.
There were all kinds of things like that of people who were forced in the system to do things that they really had no business doing. Is it still like that, is my question.
I think that now, in comparison also with the time that I was in school in Montana, there are more possibilities for kids to search for what they'd like to do and experiment with that. So I think that it's not as channeled. You know, also there's a real, you know, channeling or labeling or grouping kids. That's one of the taboo words you don't even say, basically, right? Because we're not supposed to do that, or say we don't do that. And so I'd say there are more possibilities for kids now. Although there are still certain things that kids have to make it through, you know, and sometimes that's very difficult on them and they do give up. So I'd like to say in addition to that, you know, Missoula's working on an alternative school for kids.
No, I didn't know that.
And so that, I'm not positive on the opening, you know, and all that for that, but I believe it's in the fall, and so that's going to take kids, just like we're talking about, either, you know, from all realms of school who are just finding it not working for them for whatever reason, and then working more individually and on shorter time periods.
We just had this fantasy that the kids should all come and there'd be this wide variety of teachers and people from the community, and that the kids could pick what would really turn them on, because it just seemed like such a waste in some cases, the way people were. You had people who were really good in the things that I was teaching, and people who couldn't have cared less, and for whom it was a total waste of time.
Well, and the simultaneous disengagement of kids, you know, in areas where they don't feel like it's working is pretty quick. It happens fast, and that's very sad, I think.
I watched this documentary on PBS last night about one of these examples of violence and shooting in the schools, and I don't want to go into that and ask your opinion on that, but the one thing that came out was that almost all these kids felt that there was no adult in their life that they could talk to about what really mattered to them. And teachers spend a lot of time with kids, in many cases more than the parents do, and this idea of a teacher being something more than someone who just feeds you information is tied up in that view of the teacher. You talked to me about, as these young kids coming out, that they don't have adults to talk to, or gay adults, that there's something missing in our community, you feel. Any suggestion how that might be remedied, or for whom that would be a good job?
Well, I think that's a crucial issue in terms of, first of all, teachers who are gay, bisexual, transgendered, or have family members, you know, that are experiencing those changes in their lives, etc. First, to talk about those things, right, and not hide them. In addition, all the related areas. You know, most obvious would be experience STDs, AIDS, etc. You know, those areas that we typically push into taboo land, right, with no mention whatsoever, or some very topical, quick, you know, mention. Instead, to be willing to talk about those, and so not to frighten parents that I'm talking graphic detail, but some mention that my life incorporates, for example, for me, someone who happens to be male that I love and live with, right, who's my partner, and what we do as a couple, not in bed, which is inappropriate, but that's a worry, of course, that they'll hear that. And secondly, that there be other teachers who come out, because one in this district does not represent the population.
No, and you're probably getting tired of being the gay teacher.
And so it's fine. On the other hand, it would be nice if it were possible. So again, I'm the least likely person that could criticize people not being able to come out, but it would be wonderful for kids, because it really is incredible talking to kids who say, I feel like I'm on a thread, but I see that you know, you may not have an incredible life from my viewpoint. However, you survive, right? You're surviving. You have a job. Things seem to be working somewhat for you, etc. And that gives me hope. So there have to be other teachers who are out. There are other teachers that kids are suspicious of anyway, and they talk about that, right? And so it's there.
What about straight teachers? What can they do? Do they have a
Well,
place in all this?
Totally. I think there are many obligations there. Just a specific obligation that was met is many of the straight teachers in my high school are in total support of the Gay Straight Alliance. They've created what they call their rooms as safe havens, so that if any of those kids feel that like they're being, you know, besieged somehow, then they can just drop in there and be taken care of or talked to by that teacher. Those teachers come to the meeting, so it's not just spoken, right? And then we'll forget that we said that and not show up. But they appear, right? Also, that they do address those topics within their subject area. There isn't a subject area where you can't address these things, right? And that if it's too difficult in your subject area, then bring it up anyway, right? There's a time from when you walk from the front of the room to the back when you talk to kids. There's a time when you're taking roll that you talk to kids, et cetera, et cetera. There's plenty of time to talk to kids about what constitutes your life in a non-aggressive but informational way that provides them with some hope, I think, about variation in life, you know.
Let's change the subject to something else.
All right.
Just for fun, and I can't think of a darn thing. We were talking about movies lately.
Boys Don't Cry.
Yeah, what did you think of Boys Don't Cry?
It had, for me, a lot of effects, but one is it made me think of growing up in Montana and an atmosphere here has in many parts been radically repressive, you know, and how you're skating on very thin ice always, I think, and still you skate on thin ice in many places.
Did you feel that way growing up?
Well, if I had thought very much, probably when I was growing up, I would have. But you know, I think generally speaking, the gay side of my life was repressed to a great extent, and so there was always a wall of fear there, right? But I don't know how much I touched it.
What's that like? I knew what I was and what I wanted, and I've never had that kind of conflict or felt guilty. Or what's it like to have a big chunk of your life like that you're not really dealing with?
I think that it's unfair for everybody who is involved. So I could speak for myself, of course, and for my wife and family for not being, not taking another step forward and embracing that and pulling it out, so to speak. So I think, I don't know how possible that was, considering the cultural construction of the time that prevented me from doing that.
Well, what you've done doesn't mean that you don't care for your wife and your daughter.
No.
That's just an exploration into something else.
Plus, I think, I think when I came out, one of my worst fears was, oh my God, I'll be the only gay person in Missoula who's been married for 17 or 18 years, remained faithful in that relationship, not had contact with men, blah, 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 Wow, that was totally off, right? Because what I find is every possibility here, right? People have been married, who've come out, who've gone back, who've been, every possibility, not just here but all over. And so I'm encouraged by that. It also makes me question, I think as we talked before, there is no right or wrong pattern, right? Who knows? Well, there are interesting designs, and so.
I know 3 heterosexuals who live together out on the edge of town. Quite reputable people and with careers that seem to be doing quite well with it. So it's not just gay people that are living different lives.
No, there's infinite variation, which is encouraging.
How's your daughter doing with this? You say she's okay? It seems to be okay?
Yeah, I think that she really is okay. She asks a lot of questions, and that's great, about, who is this, what's going on, why are these people together? Are they a couple? What's that mean? Do they get married? Can they have kids? How do they touch each other? Why are they touching this? You know, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of communication about that. So generally speaking, I don't see her uneasy, mostly because she's a great communicator. And so with other kids, I see a lot of questioning, you know, but they're not asking questions that where we should be getting some information out, basic information.
Your partner is a university teacher.
Right.
And the university, yeah, Casey Charles. And the university is, some in the university are trying to get rights for gay couples.
We're actively working on that. In fact, he's going to a meeting Friday, right, to present the case again to the provost to see if they can have the decision reversed.
How does that look?
I think everyone is optimistic, and there really aren't reasons to refuse that reversal based on the fact that it's economically sound and not threatening to the insurance system, and that across the university there's been support from student organizations, from the faculty senate, and from the president himself. And so they are riding on a wave of strong support, both in terms of evidence and people's emotion.
You seem to be someone who cherishes and wants a partner in your life as you go along. Having tried it from both sides, in a sense, how do you feel about the legality? I mean, what did you enjoy as the husband of a woman that you might not enjoy as the partner of a man?
Well, that's the whole thing that's brewing, huh? With what's happening in Vermont and the union of people, of couples, and I think that basic things in terms of inheritance, you know, tax, et cetera, there isn't any way to get to those things unless we're able to somehow develop, first of all, a title for what we're going to be, unions, partners, married couples or whatever, and that has to happen. I'm not sure that what I really want to see, though, is a copy of heterosexual marriage, but rather perhaps some interesting evolution, you know, that would be different.
I got word that in France, where this law has gone into effect, a lot of heterosexuals are using it because it is a little more flexible about the relationship. Since it's not officially a marriage, then there's no official divorce, and yet you can live together and have benefits, and that it's becoming a big alternative for heterosexuals. And there's talk that Vermont might do that as well, that it might not be something that heterosexuals, when they get used to it, might not find that it's such a bad idea for themselves as well. Would you like that stamp of approval on your relationship? Would that be something you would desire?
I don't like that stamp of approval. So no, I would not. No, I know what you're saying, but I wouldn't want the stamp of approval. I would like to be able to access the benefits. So initially my hackles go up when I think stamp of approval.
Well, I meant them to.
Right. Yuck. Which is also why I'm saying I don't think that I want to follow. I don't want to follow the footsteps of what's been done in terms of marriage before. But I would like to see a way for us to access those rights that we should have. Period. Right. That's not something we should have to be begging for. We should have it. Period. So.
The reason I kind of laid that trap, if it was, is that there was a time, and you were around as well, when gay meant that it was a challenge to the straight world, that it was an alternative, that the straight world was in need of reform, and that we were going to provide an example. And I don't think I went to a marriage until I was in my 30s, just on ethical grounds. I didn't support the institution, and therefore I wouldn't go to weddings of friends until I finally realized how dumb that was. But and now it's almost as if we're joining the crowd or joining the club and saying, oh yeah, we're just like everybody else. We have our barbecues. And although I want the rights, there's something about this whole, giving in to the middle class vision that troubles me a bit. Do you feel that way at all?
Of course I do. And also, I can't remember. Is it Beyond Normal or Warner's book, I can't remember. No. In any event, there's a book that I was just reading that talks about that very thing, and also that, of course, it is exclusionary for still yet another group of people, right, who will not fit those rubrics of unionizing, it's, in a new sense. Partners are the new style of marriage, nor should they have to, right? And so I think that needs to be carefully carved out.
I didn't ask you this the other day, but do you have religious principles? Are you a churchgoer, non-churchgoer, find it useless, or?
I grew up in the Lutheran Church and was confirmed and participated in that as a kid. And then having lived in Spain and Latin America several years, attended the Catholic Church. I'd say it's kind of my own internalized, rather free-form version, and so it doesn't adhere to. I'm very leery as a gay person of church, I'd have to say, because in spite of the fact that church they have an open arms policy to acceptance, there's a dagger behind that cloak, I feel, oftentimes, which is, yes, we accept you, but our Constitution says that you're immoral, you're going to go to hell, et cetera, right? Or we can fix you if we have you in our arms long enough. And so that frightens me, that at the front door I'm accepted, at the back door there's a crowd waiting to lynch me unless I change to fit the appropriate behavior. So that's pretty pessimistic, probably. But
No, you articulated the view of a lot of people, and I'm glad to hear it said. I don't agree with it, but I'm glad to have someone else say it as well. Tell me you were talking about how you worked on a program for HIV prevention with migrant workers?
Right.
I found that just fascinating. How did that work, and what did you do?
And because I speak Spanish, I've been a recruiter for Migrant Ed for, this will be my 7th year, I believe. And so that entails just helping families get their kids enrolled in school and then providing services for kids, health, psychological, attorneys, services, et cetera, et cetera. In any event, that came down to also helping with some curricular things. And I was asked to be a consultant on a program where we were working on STDs, HIV, creating boundaries and appropriate boundaries and frontiers with kids and adults and other children, and how to create more open lines of communication between kids and also between their parents. And so because I could translate for that as a consultant, and because I'd been in the field for several years working with not just grade school or preschool, so I deal with newborn up to high school age, but I also have a really interesting group of kids called Emancipated Youth. And they are between the ages, I think, technically of, if I remember, about 15 to 22, I believe, right there. In any event, those kids face a lot of additional problems. They're traveling by themselves. They frequently are involved in violent situations. There's alcoholism. There is, of course, sexual contact of all types within the groups and with people and communities they come in contact with. So there needs to be some serious talk with many of them, right, with both groups of people, kids that are with families and kids who don't have them. And so with Hispanic kids, that's especially difficult because many of the areas that we talk about with some freedom here are still taboo within Hispanic community in certain places, or in many places, I could say, without being too generalizing, I think. So that's how I got into it, and it was very interesting. I worked with a person who developed sets of cartoons that showed parents and kids talking, or groups of older kids talking, and with some dialogue put in, but mostly blank. And so what those were meant to be was when we actually had kids in school or they were at home, that was supposed to kind of stimulate them to think about what they were thinking and then fill in themselves, either in English or Spanish, right? And then yes or no, share that within a classroom with other kids, right?
One of these kids went to some school here in the States?
Yeah, they did. So many, migrant communities in the U.S. are oftentimes not from Mexico anymore or out of the U.S., right? But they're actually groups of kids that migrate across states. So they're intrastate, for example, in Montana, our biggest migrant group is from Washington State, and then California, and then Mexico. So
You mean these are American kids from?
that they're
Or
Some of them are born here, yeah, not all of them. It's a mixture, you know, of both. Some born in the U.S., some born outside, and then they just travel. The qualification for migrant education is that you have to cross school boundary lines, you know, to qualify within another school district for services for families who are legally considered migratory families.
that's a bigger problem in the eastern part of the state, isn't it? It used to be the sugar beets were,
It used to be the eastern part of the state, and the site that I work on now actually recruits the most kids, in combination with Missoula, we have a lot of people here who are considered migratory in our population, amongst the Hmong and Russian families, right, who actually travel across school boundary lines. But the group that I deal with is Flathead Lake, you know, and they deal with agricultural things of all types, but mostly cherry picking. And so that turns out to be the biggest recruitment site in the state now. You were right, before it would have been around Billings, but that's all dropped off because of mechanization and also the really specific sorts of chemicals that are used with sugar beets now. So anyway, it was a fascinating thing to work with, just because we got to broach subjects with Hispanic kids that are really still taboo, but we kind of had a little plank to, you know, step out onto.
well, you dealt with Native American kids up at St. Ignatius, didn't you? You taught up there for a while?
Yeah, for 7 years.
What was, I hesitate to say what was that like, because 7 years you can't capsulize that, but interesting experience. How did you?
Yeah, I can't think of a better way to have begun teaching, you know, than to be on the reservation, that reservation specifically, to have tribal and the existing, you know, Anglo life that's there, and then the mixture between the two worlds, you know. So we talk about syncretism in churches and religion, right? Or one religion sort of piggybacks or is symbiotic with the other one, and so that's the way all of society really is there. It's, you know, it's an interesting mixture, and they're both feeding off each other all the time. And then there's some pure, or at least within the Native American, I believe, part of it, there's a pure area that's fairly untouched, however small still, you know.
Not living on a reservation, we get a totally different view, don't we, of what Indian life is like.
I think that if I were to think of my students' response to how, you know, when I ask them questions about Flathead Reservation, it's either highly romanticized, you know, about the ideal life that's lived by Native Americans on the reservation, or else it's highly prejudiced. Well, both of them are a form of prejudice, but highly prejudiced in terms of underdeveloped, you know, all the prejudices that we don't need to talk about that deal with people other than ourselves. So, and then generally speaking, not a lot of just common sense about, you know, what life is like on the reservation, unless you have Native American kids in classes who tend to have a pretty hard time in the mainstream schools here.
Did you have any experience with gay kids or kids of any kind that didn't fit in that situation?
On the reservation
Yeah.
in St. Ignatius, not overtly gay or lesbian kids. It was just not talked about. I'd say most of the problems that I saw in a possible area, you know, sliding over a bit, would be in terms of race. That there were problems incorporating other kids from other tribes, or kids who were not Indian, white, but other races that were moving in.
I found that fascinating. As I was growing up, I thought, well, Indians are all the same, and then as I started knowing more people, there were tribal divisions and people who wouldn't speak to people in the Indian community as well as between white and Indian and
It gets complicated.
Mexican and black and
Very true.
I can't think of another question to ask you. Maybe that's a good time to sign off. Do you have any messages you want to get out, things you want to say to?
I think the main message that we'd also discussed earlier was my wish that, first of all, heterosexual or whatever sexual, because that heterosexual is so limiting to teachers, have that responsibility to talk, you know, to be more open and discuss and talk about diversity, and that there be other teachers who are gay, bisexual, transgendered, or whatever, you know, in that wealth of categories that we now have. be that there be some who are out at all levels of teaching. You know, I think K through 12. So that's a gay teacher is a palpable entity, right, and not a myth around which develop very bizarre interpretations.
Well, you've been a very good example for any of those people who might want to do that. Thank you
Thank you.
very much.